Lance Kim was here as an undergraduate in nuclear mechanical engineering. He did an MS-MPP, Master of Science, Master of Public Policy, which is undergoing a bit of a renaissance right now. And then he did his PhD with us some years ago. He's had a very interesting career at the intersection of technology and policy. Most recently, he was a research fellow for the Nuclear Security Unit of the Institute for Trans-Uranium Elements of European Commission Joint Research Center in ISPRA, focused on open source information acquisition analysis for nuclear security and non-proliferation, and acquisition pathways analysis. He's worked before in other areas of IAEA, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He was a Stanford Nuclear Security Fellow of the RAND Corporation, and I think is here to tell us some very, very interesting things. So, Lance, take it away.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's great to be back here in Berkeley and be able to tell you about some of the things I've been working on while I was in Italy for the last few years. It's great to talk to some of the students earlier today and see a lot of parallels in what I'll be talking about today, and great to see that sort of enthusiasm and interest here at Berkeley in the Nuclear Policy Working Group. So hopefully this is informative, and hopefully we can chat more about some of your work, and I'd like to see how it progresses. So I titled my talk today, Proving the Negative, because I think it really encapsulates the key challenge affecting nuclear safeguards today, and that is proving the absence of nuclear activities. This is particularly important because as safeguards continues to evolve, it has become more dependent on assessments of a state's nuclear capabilities and also assessments of the absence of undeclared nuclear activities. And so while this is done with the goal of optimizing safeguards for greater effectiveness and efficiency, this does create some potential vulnerabilities when the system is too highly optimized for expected conditions. And so we have to sort of think about what these vulnerabilities and uncertainties might be. And so that's where I will be speaking today. So one disclaimer I have to get out of the way is that these opinions are my own. They don't represent my previous employer, the European Commission, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and so forth. So, but they probably should be. That's another story. So just to quickly outline my talk today, I'll be introducing the IAEA state-level concept for safeguards implementation, some of the conceptual considerations that I've been thinking about over the last couple of years, and how this leads to implementation challenges for safeguards. And based on this discussion, it leads me to my two main research questions, and that is how quantifiable is path completion time, which is something we discussed earlier today, and also how much is enough for the detection of undeclared activities. How do we assure ourselves, how do we prove the negative that there is no undeclared activity within that state? And based on this discussion and based on these research questions, I'll identify some what I think are policy relevant insights to support continued development. And I'll advocate for a sort of evidence-based approach, surprise-sensitive approach to drive further development of the state-level concept. So I didn't want to spend too much time on the history of the evolution of safeguards, but I just wanted to focus on the status of safeguards today. And the current sort of concept for safeguards is this IAEA state-level concept. And the basic idea is pretty simple to understand. The IAEA amasses as much information as they can about a state, and then develops tailored safeguards implementation to the particularities of that state. And it collects that information through both the state declarations, its in-field verification activities, and also headquarters-based activities, like looking through open source information. And of course, it also relies on third-party information, which is sort of the euphemism for our intelligence agencies. Providing information, which of course they then have to independently verify. They can't just take these agencies at their word. So based on all this information, it develops a picture of the state's technical capabilities to pursue an acquisition pathway. And an acquisition pathway are the steps necessary to produce weapons usable fissile material. And it does this through a process called acquisition path analysis, where it collects all this information about a state's past, present, and future nuclear capabilities and estimates the time necessary to complete a pathway, whether it be enrichment of uranium or the reprocessing of spent fuel to produce plutonium. And from there, based on that information, it then establishes technical objectives and identifies appropriate safeguards measures to develop an annual implementation plan, which it then implements in the field. And based on their findings, they will then establish their findings and draw safeguards conclusions. one of which is the broader conclusion, whether or not there are any indications of undeclared activities within a state. One of the features of the state level concept that is not apparent in that previous diagram, which is something that the IEA put together, is the role of state-specific factors. The IEA has identified 6 categories of state-specific factors that it will use to differentiate states without discrimination. And I just want to focus on the first 2, that is the safeguards regime and the nuclear fuel cycle and related capabilities of the state. And these, of course, feed into the various processes of the acquisition pathways analysis and other following processes to establish a safeguards implementation plan, and the ultimate goal is to improve safeguards effectiveness and efficiency. And there's sort of a big discussion about why this is happening. There are basically budget constraints at the IEA and sort of anticipated future growth in nuclear power, which are driving these sorts of innovations. And so I just want to focus on the first 2 categories of state-specific factors, and that's the safeguards regime, including the broader conclusion, and also the nuclear fuel cycle and related capabilities of the state and how that might affect safeguards implementation. You can sort of think of like 2 extreme examples. You might have a state with an additional protocol and the broader conclusion that there are no untoward activities in the state. And for that, let's say that state is relatively unsophisticated. So for those types of states, you might consider reducing the intensity and frequency of safeguards because it would take them quite a long time to complete an acquisition pathway. Of course, the opposite would be true if you have a highly sophisticated state without an additional protocol, or maybe they've had some incidents of past non-compliance in their history. And so for those states, you would not think about relaxing safeguards requirements for obvious reasons. And so the whole goal here is to, like I said, use these state-specific factors to achieve these effectiveness and efficiency gains. As a result of this differentiation without discrimination goal, this has raised some controversy amongst the member states, a lot of questions about whether or not one can actually differentiate states without discrimination. And one of these sticking points is how quantifiable or how objective are these state-specific factors. And there's quite a lot of disagreement. There's some people who consider them to be hardly quantifiable, others say they're well quantifiable, indisputable facts, not open to ambiguity, that sort of thing. As you can see on these sort of categories of information, there is quite a bit of disagreement, which I find curious because a lot of these things are what I would sort of call technical efficiencies that are sort of non-controversial. So for instance, in safeguards implementation, you might think about whether a state has a cloudy spent fuel pool. And that, of course, would hinder one's ability to do a Cherenkov verification and that sort of thing. To me, those are sort of technical efficiencies. And what's curious is that there is quite a lot of agreement on the first 2 categories of state-specific factors. They're considered well quantifiable, indisputable facts, and so on. And these are the safeguards conclusion, that is the broader conclusion, for instance, that an undeclared capability doesn't exist, and also the nuclear fuel cycle and related capabilities of the state. And as I sort of alluded to at the beginning, these are important because if one underestimates these capabilities, if in fact a state has a clandestine weapons capability and we underestimate their ability to have one, then this could lead to false negative errors, right? They might lead to untimely detection of the proliferation significant events and lead to bad outcomes. So again, like I said, it's sort of curious that there seems to be some consensus on these factors because in my view, they are sort of the fundamental changes of how we do business, the business of safeguards. So I want to jump right into my first research question, is sort of this question of how quantifiable is completion time. And I want to spend a little bit of time on how this is done. This is done through the acquisition pathways analysis. And it's a fairly straightforward concept to understand. You start with the declarations of the declared capabilities and sort of connect the dots between those declared capabilities and a clandestine capability. And then estimate, and of course the state can pursue various pathways to do this. It might produce material and equipment indigenously, it might divert material from declared activities, misuse declared capabilities, or pursue purely undeclared parallel clandestine paths, including producing or building a parallel path clandestinely or importing material in an undeclared way. One of the key features that I want to draw your attention to is this notion of technical plausibility. And so as the IEA draws these sort of connections between declared capabilities and target material, it sort of discards the pathways that are declared or thought to be technically implausible. And the way it does that is to say if a state is judged not to be capable of achieving that pathway within 5 years, it's then deemed implausible. And presumably this is done to reduce analytical burdens, to reduce the number of paths one has to trace out and analyze. So and also I want to keep that 5-year number in mind, because I'll return to that a little later in the talk. So to address this question of how quantifiable is completion time, there are basically what I call two sources of uncertainty: informational uncertainty and analytical uncertainties. And I think we're sort of all aware of, sort of the garbage in, garbage out model. If you have bad data, you might produce bad results. If there are analytical uncertainties, even if you have perfect data, it might still produce garbage results. And so I looked. That's a little harsh, but. So the first part, information uncertainties. Here, I think the first thing everyone needs to consider when doing this analysis is that there will always be information asymmetries between the state and the IEA, the inspectorate, that is. The state will always know more about its own capabilities. That's sort of obvious. The problem is, we have to consider both the hide and seek dynamic between the inspector and the state, and it kind of depends on how sophisticated the state is. Are they like playing hide and seek with their nephew hiding behind a tree, or are they like a hiding trained sniper? And so there's a big question mark as to who will win this arms race, this sort of hide and seek game. There are a number of ways that a state could deny and deceive us through various techniques. For instance, open source information analysis are maybe particularly vulnerable to these sorts of things. Just getting more clever about hiding things from satellite imagery. If you start monitoring literature, for instance, you may just not publish or pursue other sort of deceptive tactics. And so you have to be aware that the information you have from open sources and even closed sources are incomplete, unreliable, and possibly even deceptive, and possibly ambiguous. So that's the first part. Second, there are, of course, a lot of analytical complexities, which I think the group in the working group are grappling with as you try to do this. I like to think about it in sort of more simplistic terms without the math at this point. There are a lot of factors that one needs to consider to calculate completion time. There are first the state preferences and resources. What are their motivations? How much money do they have? How clever are they? One also needs to consider the intrinsic technical difficulty of that pathway, and then compare that to the state's technical capabilities to get sort of an estimate of time. And this is a really hard thing to do because there are a lot of variables at play. There are numerous sources of uncertainty. I don't want to spend too much time here. You can sort of read through the list. And to preview sort of my recommendations, what's necessary is, in my view, to avoid sort of these bad outcomes, these technological surprises, is to assume that a state is highly motivated, highly resourceful, and will pursue pathways that are easier than assumed, and basically find the minimum time that's necessary in order to complete this pathway. One thing I want to focus on is this issue of state preferences and resources. And this is important because it's basically been shown that these omitted state-specific factors have dramatic impacts on completion time estimates. I call these omitted state-specific factors because under the IEA's process, one can't consider things like the state's security environment when calculating completion path. And we've seen some evidence of schedule compression. This is an example from the Hanford project. This is sort of a retrospective analysis written by one of the project managers who claims that he accelerated the completion time of this project from 19 years down to 5 years. Right, that's like about a factor 3, can't do that. One of the interesting things is, of course, that the security situation of the state, like I said, is not a state-specific factor, cannot be used to differentiate states, right? And because of this, it might be considered a subjective political extraneous factor, and due to the lack of guidance, this gives analysts a lot of wiggle room in terms of the sort of ultimate answer they come up with. And one of the this nice papers on this that I'd like to point out is this dissertation work by Sweeney, where he claims that pathway decisions are determined by various motivations and institutional impediments that often weigh these pure engineering management decisions that lead to this outcome. And like I was saying, there is a danger here in these sort of uncertainties and lack of guidance on motivation, the state's motivations, because these sorts of analytical uncertainties leave room for various forces of bias to creep in to the analysis that could be construed as discriminatory. This is a list of some biases that have been observed in US intelligence assessments. Another very great paper to read, Misestimation Explaining US Failures to Predict Nuclear Weapons Programs. And he goes through and finds various cases for political biases, cultural biases, bureaucratic and organizational factors that tend to skew these assessments one way or the other. One particularly interesting one is to look at are these examples of cultural biases. And here we look at a few different examples and whether or not their capabilities were overestimated or underestimated. You might be tempted to say that, well, Germany and France, their capabilities were overestimated because, they sort of have some inherent faith in their scientific capabilities, while other countries were underestimated. It's tempting to say, some might interpret this as being racially biased. It could also reflect a fundamental misunderstanding or lack of understanding of their economic systems. So it's not always sort of driven by racial factors, but it is sort of interesting to look at these cases. And a lot of it is in the eye of the beholder. It's sort of very difficult to prove discrimination, even in employment law, that sort of thing. Yes, if there are any questions, please stop me.
Iraq, underestimated once, overestimated once, right?
Right, yeah.
So what changed?
I don't know. It may have been, that some of that may be sort of an overreaction, right, to the previous failures. Let's see, underestimated once, yes, underestimated once, overestimated a second time. And so there is sort of this dynamic that does occur. So that's one possible explanation just on the top of my head. But I didn't study that case in a lot of detail. I just wanted to point this out as some examples of biases that can creep in. And so I looked at the theory of acquisition pathway analysis, and of course we can talk about theoretical possibilities all day long. They can go one way or the other depending on which sort of factor dominates. And so instead I tried to seek out some evidence. And one place where they do a lot of this completion time assessment is in the intelligence community. They obviously track developments in a foreign nuclear program to try to estimate how soon they might complete a nuclear program of political significance. And in the study of misestimation, they found a general tendency to overestimate a state's nuclear weapons capabilities, which is a good thing, right? You want to overestimate their capabilities.
No, we went to war because we
Yes, I was about to get to that. There are obviously some downsides. So the downside to that is that it potentially leads to some alarmism, right? So you have to strike this balance. But the curious thing is when you strip out the weapons-related phases of a program and look just at the cases cited on the development of the nuclear fuel cycle, we found the opposite effect. Looking at this small data set, basically found a tendency to underestimate their fuel cycle development capabilities so that they would develop things sooner than expected, which is a bit of a problem when it comes to the...
There's been some recent studies which have really highlighted that there's for these cases, it's important to divide them into two cohorts, pre-NPT and post-NPT.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because they're just apparently very different stories. So I'm curious if you were to split out those different cohorts, whether you end up in with the same sort of conclusions.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. This is a very limited data set, and it is historical, and it's also aggregated, so I haven't split those sorts of effects out. So it is definitely worth more study. There are other issues. First of all, just a small sample size, so drawing statistically relevant conclusions from this is pretty sketchy to begin with. And also some of the coding issues, is this really 10 years? There are some sort of vague estimates, like this could happen in the next decade and it happened at a certain date, so is that a 10-year error or that sort of thing? But the general idea here that I'm trying to convey is that the variance in these estimates can be on the order of a few years, 5 years, that sort of thing. And if you remember that 5-year criteria, which is the criteria for technical plausibility, basically what this implies is that you may have assessed a capability to be implausible within 5 years may already exist within that state, right? The uncertainties are of that order. There are some other issues with this. Analysts typically state some level of confidence in their assessment, right? And that's not included here, so one might see these bars sort of be weighted by that confidence factor, and that might see that shrink down a little bit. But this is sort of just initial work on this topic. Right, so getting back to the table, I think on the quantifiability of on the nuclear fuel cycle and related capabilities, you might sort of color that yellow from a green and kind of put in a question mark about that, and say that it might require some additional thought and research. So now we'll move on to the next bit about safeguards conclusions and how much effort is needed to have confidence that an undeclared program doesn't exist within a state. And this, so I mentioned this before, this is the broader conclusion, and the interesting part about the broader conclusion is that it's drawn for a state when there are no indications found that give rise to proliferation concern within a state. And on the basis of this, the IEA then might consider reduction in the safeguards frequency and intensity for these states under the broader conclusion. Critics will argue that when you look at the language here, no indications have been found. It sort of has shifted the question, or it shifted it from a system of where guilt was presumed on the part of the state to one where you now presume the innocence of a state. So basically, under the old safeguards regime, you basically assumed that a clandestine activity was occurring in that state when you determined your timeliness requirements for declared activities. So for example, you might say, in order to set your inspection frequency at a spent fuel pool, you would assume that a reprocessing facility was available and ready to receive that spent fuel. And so you then establish your inspection guidelines based on that. And so it essentially presumed guilt on the part of the state. Now we sort of shifted to a presumption of innocence that unless we see evidence, unless you're proven guilty, we'll assume that it does not exist, right? Or to some extent. Yes?
But that's contingent upon having agreed to an additional protocol.
Right.
Because the presumption of guilt is if you don't have additional protocol.
Right.
And then you switch that if you're willing to take on additional protocol to presumption of innocence.
Right. That's absolutely right.
But you can now verify.
Yes, and the question is to what extent can we verify? And that's sort of where the critics come in. How do we prove the negative? There's sort of what's the word I'm looking for here? The arguments, I guess. They'll say the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. You can't prove a negative. Now, when you talk to logicians or philosophers, they'll argue that yes, you can prove a negative. If we couldn't, we'd probably believe this picture of Bigfoot riding the Loch Ness Monster. These sorts of things. How do we? And it's an interesting sort of thought process. How do we come to believe that there is no Bigfoot or Loch Ness Monster? And it's sort of a similar thought process when talking about clandestine nuclear activities within a state. Looking in this room, I think I can prove very readily to most people's satisfaction that there is no elephant in this room. Right? It just takes a simple look around the room. But looking for an ant takes a lot more effort, right? There's cookies over there and a nice panettone, which is unseasonal, right next.
It's left.
Yeah.
It's evidence for graduate students.
Yeah, sugar calories, fantastic, yes. I can't really eat that stuff anymore, just go sideways now. So to try to get traction on this, this is sort of some initial work that I've been working on. Just as I was leaving the JRC, we're still working on a paper to put this together, is looking into search theory and how we might develop some insights into this problem of proving the negative. So we sort of dusted off some of the old books on optimal search theory. This was initially developed for naval engagements, hunter-killer submarines, that sort of thing. It's been used in looking for downed aircraft. This is sort of a posterior distribution of a lost aircraft, and taking into account things like currents and that sort of thing to push this bit of wreckage around. I'm not sure how useful it is because they still haven't found that plane. What was it? MH something.
270.
Right. So it doesn't. It's not a panacea, but it's interesting to think through. And again, I don't want to get into sort of the mathematical details because I think we all have sort of an intuitive sense for how this works. If you've ever lost your keys in your house, you might sort of start a systematic search process looking where you might have last left it, the usual places. After that, you might sort of start a random search, or maybe a more efficient sort of systematic search, so you don't overlap your search paths. You may think about using a metal detector, right, which has sort of a defined sweep width as you scan along. But then, of course, you catch a lot of metal objects that are not your keys, and then you have to spend time investigating that.
Don't you have spare keys?
And eventually you give up because you have better things to do with your time and you have a spare set of keys, right?
Well, do you know of any one instance where science has helped locate clandestine nuclear activity?
I would hope so.
I don't think it has. I think every
Depends on what
example
you-
has been, a rat.
Right. To what extent that's science, the folks that are tapping into phone lines. And, I was telling this story earlier, I think what I've read in the open source about the discovery of the Al-Kabar reactor in Syria. And I'll discuss this actually a little bit later, where they basically suppressed the thermal or visual signatures and disguised it behind a facade to look like a Byzantine fortress, right? And the way they discovered it apparently was through unusual phone traffic between North Korea and some remote place in Syria. At least that's how the story goes. So to what extent is that science versus intelligence and spooks and that sort of stuff?
Well, it's just
boots on the ground, human sources.
It doesn't sound like a very deep application of formal logic or analytics.
Right. But some of that is driven by this sort of thing. For instance, if you imagine the signals that might come from a clandestine program through, let's say, a literature review, an open source literature review, what are the odds that that signal might even, what are the odds that they will even publish that sort of information in the first place? How do you piece those things together? How much information do you have to comb through to get these hints? And
Or how many Berkeley and MIT PhDs in nuclear engineering are now going back to those countries?
Right. And how many Berkeley and PhD engineers are on the other side of the fence working against them. Right? That's part of this hide and seek dynamic I was talking about earlier. And it's sort of, like I said, not clear who's going to win.
Hasn't environmental sampling been effective, for example, in implicating Iran?
Well, yeah, that's another interesting question that we were talking about earlier. Looking at the current goings on at the Parchin site, they found a couple of particles of possible anthropogenic origins. And it wasn't enough to sort of convict them to say, aha, you're up to no good at this site, right? And sort of the story that's been out there is that environmental sampling is a very powerful tool, which I agree it is. But if there were nuclear activities at that site and they only found 2 particles, then does that suggest that maybe they were successful in cleaning it up adequately? So maybe there are some questions there. But yes, I agree overall it is a very powerful tool. It's very hard to sort of eliminate all the ants from this room. And environmental sampling is one of those things that would pick that up, if there were any. Of course, there are also sort of inspection issues there, inspection procedure issues there, not quite clear what happens. Were they inspecting themselves? How much control did the IEA have? A lot of questions there. Yes, so the other aspect of search theory is this concept of optimal search theory, optimal search and stop theory. Or the conditions for optimal search and stop. And so it sort of sets up, by looking into this, we might think about how search theory informs stopping criteria for efforts to determine how much is enough. This is something I'm still looking into, but my sort of initial thinking is that there are no clear answers. But it still might be useful to think through it sort of in a systematic way and to inform the discussion. So there are sort of 2 camps. like in everything, most things in life. There are those who think there's a seeker advantage. So this is a infrared image that I pulled from, of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant that I pulled from Landsat via the Google Earth engine. And it's quite amazing how much is available in the open source these days. You go type in Google Earth engine, download this image, and you can produce it quite readily, and it seems to suggest a thermal plume coming out of Diablo Canyon. The picture on the right is where an example where maybe the hider has an advantage, or maybe the hider might win. This is the picture of that Al-Kabar reactor in Syria, which was hidden underneath the fake roof, and it was made to look like a Byzantine fortress. So it's an example of visual signature suppression at this site. And I really love these quotes because I think it really sort of, sort of jives with my experience at the IAEA, or at the Joint Research Center. We had another fellow working on things that we were kind of always, not at odds, but discussing things. So they're sort of the people that think about the seeker advantage, all of our technical capabilities, all of our whiz-bang stuff, and we're sort of characterized as over-enthusiastic arms control polemicists who reassure us that all is well because we can read license plate numbers from 200 kilometers away. And then there's sort of the other side where the professional fearmongers who dream up bizarre evasion scenarios, right? Defeating even the most sophisticated monitoring device, leading to ultimate victory for the ruthless and imaginative cheater. And I think that really captures sort of, the sort of things you hear in these discussions. One of the things that drive this is that intentions really matter, which is sort of a theme from before in the previous section. So even in the case of when you're observing cooperative behavior in a state, it might be considered evidence of deception if you believe that the other side has bad intentions, right? And we kind of see some of this. Well, one topic we were discussing earlier is we were looking at some satellite images of two suspect facilities. One had security features, guns, gates, and guards that you can see and observe in imagery, and the other one did not. And in both cases, the conclusion was that it's a suspect facility, a suspicious facility. And in the first case, it was suspicious because it had security features. All right, it might suggest that they're trying to hide something or guard something very well. In the second one, without any visible security features, the conclusion was they're suppressing their signatures of a security system. So they must really want to hide this thing, right? And how does the presence of a signature and the absence of the signature lead you to the same conclusion? It's sort of an interesting topic. And I think part of the answer is that really your sort of preconceived notions about that site has a powerful role to play. This is a case from World War II Germany, as Allied agents and things were roaming around Germany, collecting water samples and that sort of thing. At some point, they sort of made the conclusion that we're not seeing a nuclear program, and they're probably not. They probably don't have a serious effort in place. But at the time, they took a very conservative approach. Again, evidence of absence is not. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It didn't definitely prove that the Germans were not. It just means maybe we're not seeing all the signals. And it wasn't only until at the end, when the Germans actually capitulated, that they could then conclude that they did not have a nuclear weapons program. After, of course, digging up their reactor and that sort of stuff. So it's sort of an interesting case study. So going back to my chart, I go back to whether or not the safeguards conclusion is well quantifiable, and I sort of, again, color it yellow. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, and put a question mark. And at this point is usually when my former boss at GRC would get very frustrated with me, pointing out all the problems and not offering any solutions. So here's my attempt to sort of develop some solutions. So how do we tackle this issue of how much is enough? One way we can do this is to evaluate the estimate of accuracy of the analysts in their ability to predict future developments in that state. So one might, or retrospectively, compare their predictions to actual events and see how well analysts did. And this would be considered maybe an evidence-based approach to quantify safeguard performance. We could see how these calibration curves shift in response to new practices, new information sets. Now, the big problem, of course, is that there are data limitations, right? Proliferation is a rare event. There aren't too many of these. Every case is kind of unique. And then even if we did have this data, the declared programs, it's hard to extrapolate declared experience with our ability to estimate declared programs to undeclared programs. Another way we can tackle this is to evaluate analyst confidence. So basically talk to the people drawing these estimating time and say, how confident are you in this estimate of time? The key advantage of that is that it's readily measured, right? You simply ask the guys or gals, and guys and gals. And then look at potentially diminishing points of diminishing returns as their information set grows, right? As we continue to delve deeper into a nuclear program, how does their confidence change? And this might inform sort of, when you reach points of diminishing return, you might sort of say, okay, we've done enough, let's move on to something else. On the right here, you see one of the key problems with this approach, in that there's, in some cases, there's been shown to be a gap between confidence and accuracy. In this case, this was a study of horse race handicappers. And as they were given more and more information about the various factors affecting the horse race performance, who's crazy, which horse, who's jockey, that sort of thing. What happened is that beyond a certain point, as they get more and more information, their accuracy sort of flatlines. Right? So they didn't get any better at predicting the outcomes of the horse race, but their confidence in their predictions grew, right? And so this is a real danger, and it's sort of reflected in the language of safeguards. We sort of say things like, do we have assurances of the absence of nuclear clandestine activities? And so if we start basing our policies on a false sense of confidence, on overconfidence, this obviously creates some potential dangers. So basically, more information doesn't necessarily lead to a clearer picture. It may just lead to overconfidence without sort of commensurate increases in the accuracy of your predictions.
So that must be based on having fewer than 8 horses in the race.
Fewer than 8 horses in the
The
race.
reciprocal of the accuracy shouldn't be lower than a random guess.
That's interesting. I haven't thought about that. I have to look back at the study. How many horses are in a race typically? That's not right, I guess. I'm not really, but I guess we can go do this experiment down here, right, at the Goldgate Fields. If that's still around, it hasn't become something else.
You can just look at the newspaper.
Right. Be more fun to go down to the fields, right? So this is the key problem with using analyst confidence. Now, there are ways to reduce this confidence accuracy gap by encouraging analysts to consider alternative outcomes. You might give them prompt performance feedback. That's a little hard to do in safeguards because these are such long-ranging things. By the time a nuclear program happens on somebody's watch, that person is long gone, so they don't really feel the direct impacts. There are also other techniques such as red teaming to sort of challenge analysts' assumptions and find all the faults and that sort of thing. And these have been shown through studies to reduce this gap. And to go back to acquisition pathways analysis, these are essentially the types of things I was thinking about to improve acquisition pathways analysis, to implement a surprise-sensitive approach that looks at various options, various end states, and really challenge analysts to consider the challenging scenarios that might otherwise go unnoticed or downplayed in some way. And so by combining assessments of analyst confidence with these sort of surprise-sensitive approaches, one might get a better sense for how to judge when enough has been done about an undeclared, develop sufficient assurances of the absence of undeclared activities. So that concludes my talk today. I just want to summarize. Initially, I discussed some of the conceptual issues or features, considerations of the state-level concept and how it leads to technical challenges in the implementation of safeguards. These sort of uncertainties deal with developing an accurate assessment of the state's past, present, and future nuclear capabilities, and also related technical capabilities, and also developing sufficient assurance of the absence of undeclared materials and activities. And sort of the solution I'm advocating for, suggesting, maybe not advocating, is a safeguards planning approach, the worry is that a safeguards planning approach based on unwarranted overconfidence may undermine safeguards efficiency and effectiveness for obvious reasons, and that a surprise-sensitive approach and data-driven performance measures may inform these questions and promote the continued development of the state-level concept. So with that, I end. I just want to end with this one slide because it's sort of one of my favorite quotes, and it's related to the theme of my talk about proving the negative. And this is this rather infamous quote from a illustrious former Secretary of Defense who talks about knowns and unknowns. And I think the last line is probably the most important thing. It's that these sort of unknown unknowns are the things that really challenge our security situation. And that's where I think I at least made some steps towards that today. So thank you very much. Are there any questions? Professor Morse.
Yes. I believe that there's never been an inspection of an American nuclear power plant by IAEA. Is that?
Well, we're sort of, as a nuclear weapons state, we're in sort of unique circumstance.
I think that alone may contribute to some of the unkind words that get said by others.
Right. That is one of the inherent tensions in the non-proliferation treaty. It sort of creates two classes of states, the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon
The
states.
U.S. offers all of its civilian facilities for inspections. The IAEA only monitors a handful.
That is right. That is also true.
Because you wasted effort.
Right. That's right. Not much
Is
there.
there a way that we can take the burden off the analyst in this approach? So we're currently limited by the unattended monitoring systems that we have in place. But if we take instead a technological approach, we could imagine RFID tags and Internet of Things.
Right.
And then you still have the risk that there could be corruption in the data.
Right.
But if something like that shows up, you go in and you investigate.
Right.
Now we're, limited by analyst approaches telling us how frequently we should go in. Can we weigh the technology with the budget issues?
So that's sort of what I would call a technical efficiency that I consider to be relatively non-controversial. So for instance, under these factors, the ability to implement safeguards measures would consider whether or not unattended monitoring systems are in place within a state. And the advantage, of course, being that they're unattended, they sort of have a constant stare at a site, and it doesn't have as many, doesn't require as many person days in the field,
Well,
which
but
is
currently
costly.
there's no feedback loop. You go in, you put in a tamper-resistant seal, and then you come back a year later and see if anybody tampered with it.
Right.
And if you can, have some increased interplay with technology, then you don't need to be as accurate in your assessment on when you need to return to check that seal.
Right, and yeah, there are very clear relationships between sort of inspection frequency and whether or not there are containment surveillance measures in place. And the key advantage is if you can verify the integrity of your containment and verify the seal, then you don't need to re-verify the contents of a container or whatever it is. Right, so that's sort of the key cost savings there, achievable with containment and surveillance, and that's, I think, used quite extensively by the IAEA as a complementary measure to nuclear materials accounting. But one of the sort of things that your comment brings to mind is, how do we reduce analyst burdens? With respect to this process, one of the burdensome tasks is tracing out all the various ways a state can acquire nuclear materials. There's just a lot of potential pathways. There has been some effort by the German support program looking at game theory methods to sort of prioritize these pathways automatically. There's quite a lot of debate, resistance, back and forth about the wisdom of this. People tend to trust the human analysts over a computer program for good reason. These sort of game theoretic models are normative. There's no guarantee that they actually describe human decisions and behavior. But on the other hand, human analysts are imperfect as well, right? People fade out, get bored. You can only look at so many pathways before your eyes glaze over. It's Friday, you gotta go somewhere. And so what some of the research has shown is that humans, even when confronted by the superior performance of an algorithm, will still prefer the human analyst, right? There's this sort of algorithm aversion that people tend to have. I'm sort of agnostic. Well, I am agnostic about it, and I think the best person or computer should win. And we should continue doing these sort of data-driven, evidence-based assessment approaches to see which approach works the best, right? And I think it'll take a lot of time in order to assess that. That's sort of a long-winded answer. Yes?
I followed the Iran deal last year.
Yes.
And as best I understand, in the middle of the year, Secretaries Kerry and Monique said they were like 2 months from a breakout where they had enough material.
I thought it was a little longer.
And
1.8.
Pardon me?
Oh, yeah, before the
1.8.
deal. Right, yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that 5,000 centrifuges, we've taken.
And then, within a relatively short time, like 3 or 4 months, the IAEA said that they had met all the agreements for the deal to go through in terms of past activities and all, without ever having admitted that they actually had a program.
Right.
Am I missing something?
No comments.
And again, the deal was not signed in Vienna.
Right.
I was involved in that, and I know that's true.
Is there a question? Are we missing anything in that deal?
Pardon me?
I think the
we're-
breakout times are obviously dependent on a lot of assumptions. You don't necessarily, there's also this problem of sneak out where they have a parallel clandestine program that one has to consider.
We're looking at an absolute fraud. Absolute fraud.
I wouldn't go that far, but yeah, there are a number of issues, and I think we should be very
Absolutely.
clear-eyed about when looking at that deal.
Absolute fraud.
Well, I would take the opposite approach. Buy stock in the companies that are selling all the sodium iodides, which IAEA designed.
Yes.
3,000 sodium iodide-based enrichment meters.
Yeah, other than fattening your portfolio, there is a lot of demand for it. There is sort of resource questions. Will the IAEA have sufficient manpower, people power in the field to do the necessary verification work? And this is there are budgetary issues, where they're going to get the money, et cetera, and the support that they need. So that is an issue that I'm.
But if they have to do it in a non-discriminatory way, then it goes completely through the ceiling. You'll have to go and look at Luxembourg as well as Iran.
Well, I don't believe there's, so the other feature of this is that the state level concept is still in its beginning stages of implementation. And clearly this will not apply to Iran because they have not yet ratified the additional protocol and that sort of thing. So I think we're not there yet. And yeah, we're not there yet. That's probably as much as I could say. Because I can't speak for the IEA and what their plans are.
One of the things, particularly for our graduates, that we like to hear people talk about is what are the opportunities for our graduates now to do some of the things that you've done? Is this the kind of thing where with high confidence, a PhD level person here has an entry-level job at the IEA? Or is it very difficult to get a job there?
My understanding is that there are some programs for junior professional officers, for instance, but they can't connect you that way. And that's sort of how my interest in safeguards started. I was just out of school, and there was a fellowship internship program managed in Brookhaven, which sponsored my year in Vienna, where I learned about non-destructive assay system. I was writing manuals for the inspectors, but I learned a lot about inspection capabilities.
So the gateway was a fellowship program,
Right.
intern, and then that led to the longer gate.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So I know there are some opportunities through the U.S. support program, which is managed through Brookhaven. So they do a pretty good job of trying to increase U.S. participation in safeguards and interest from students. But for that, you can probably talk to Susan Pepper and bring her in.
Yeah, they have an application app on the website.
Right.
It's pretty straightforward. The only difference in the deal is you can only stay there for a couple of years.
Right, right. Yeah, there are very few sort of permanent positions at the IEA.
For cause.
Right. It is nice to maintain some institutional memory. You can't completely wipe the slate clean because then you start forgetting important things that happened before. Yeah, and you read through the history of some of these programs, it's fascinating. Talk to some of the people that have been in this business for a long time and the stories they tell, and a lot of interesting lessons to be learned.
Let's thank our speaker again.